Words from the Gospel of Luke, the 8th chapter. While Jesus was on his way, he could scarcely breathe for the crowds, and among them was a woman who had suffered from hemorrhage for 12 years, and nobody had been able to cure her. She came up from behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and at once her hemorrhage stopped. Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" Everybody disclaimed it, and Peter said, "Master, the crowds are hemming you in and pressing upon you from every side." But Jesus said, "Someone did touch me." Then the woman, seeing that she was detected, came trembling and fell at his feet. Before all the people, she explained why she had touched him and how she had been cured. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Is there anything we care more about on most days than our health? With the growing cost of Medicaid and Medicare, it's at the center of some of our national budget problems. There's a story making the rounds about the arrival of several prominent people from the medical world at St. Peter's Gate. Christian Barnard arrives and refers to his heart transplant, and St. Peter says, "Come right in." Jonah Salk arrives and mentions his vaccine, and St. Peter says, "Come on in." Somebody named John Nelson shows up, allows us how he invented managed health care and saved the country millions. St. Peter says, "Well, come in." And then he adds, "But you only get 3 days." Health care is one of our major industries. It's over 10% of the gross national product. At the more personal level, our health is a driving and rather omnipresent concern, is it not, for all of us, especially in these days of added stress and threat? And what percentage of television commercials offer some pill or drug to alleviate our pain, our ache, our discomfort? In the next 12 months, we will consume somewhere around 20,000 tons of aspirin or the like. That works out to about 225 tablets per person per year. If we were to go by the sales figures, most every American has a headache most of the time. We Americans ingest millions of vitamins and herbs and drugs every day. I checked my multivitamin the other day and I counted up 36 minerals and vitamins. Health clubs, health letters all over the place, health magazines, advice columns. New York Times publishes a Sunday magazine on the subject at least twice a year. Whole industries have developed to cater to the desire for everlasting youthfulness and vitality. Numerous manufacturers sell us treadmills, stair walkers, and other odd-looking devices for self-torture. I've seen the same rowing machine go through rummage 3 years running. And I was wondering this last summer what the present occupant does with it, because we didn't have rummage, but I'm sure it'll be back next year. I've taken up walking again to keep my weight down. There's no physical activity that requires less equipment than walking. Walking is the ultimate no-equipment activity. Oh, maybe you need a good pair of those walking shoes, shorts and t-shirt, of course. And then nothing to do but get out there and go. Well, nothing except maybe buy a new warm-up suit and maybe a digital stopwatch with a pulse reading capability and a few headbands and a combination FM/AM cassette player and a battery tester and charger for the cassette player and a pedometer maybe. Need I go on? But never mind, I'm in the American mainstream, I walk. And all of this is nothing new. For centuries, we human beings have worried about, sought cures for, swallowed innumerable nostrums to help with, flocked to anyone who could promise health. And it was no different in Jesus' day. Healers abounded, offering miracles and magic in response to the pleas and pains of the first century medical patient. And healing is certainly at the forefront of his ministry, his efforts on behalf of human suffering, but with some remarkable differences from the culture of his day. You see, Christians believe that in the story of Jesus we discover the way that God relates to our world and to our individual lives. And clearly for Jesus, this world is not yet the kingdom of God. He describes what it would be. He sets out to establish a kind of beachhead for it. He teaches us to pray for its coming, which we do. But put another way, he sees earthly existence as very unfinished, still plagued by unruly powers counter to the will of God. He sees the main meaning of our days here, in part, in fact, as a kind of warfare against these powers of evil, of sin, of sickness, anything that diminishes human life and makes it less than God wants it to be. So from Jesus' perspective, illness and evil are never something that God inflicts, some karma that we must accept and endure as our just due. Rather, they are always the enemy. And God's Spirit is present in every effort and struggle to conquer these, calls us to join him in that fight with all the tools at our disposal, spiritual and material, to the end that one day his kingdom may come. So in the story of Jesus, we read again and again of encounters, for example, with physical disease, like this account of the woman who has endured a hemorrhage for 12 years. You know, parenthetically, one evidence that Luke himself may have been a physician lies in the change that he makes from Mark's earlier account. Mark in his gospel says she had spent all she had on physicians. And Luke softens the blow a little bit by saying nobody was able to help her. But in either case, what do we know about her? She clearly was a determined lady who had not given up hope. And she saw something different in Jesus that encouraged that hope. And what was that? The way he reached out across the barriers of religious law and boundary to embrace and seek to help all comers. You see, a woman with her problem at that time was excluded from society by Levitical law. She was unclean in the Old Testament sense of the term. She had been excommunicated from the religious community. She was without relationship to the God of her fathers. She was literally an outcast. Had Jesus not seemed very different from the other religious leaders, she probably would have not had the courage to do what she did. And even then, it was a matter of slipping up behind him, unseen, unnoticed in the crowd, venturing only to reach out and touch the tassels hanging from his prayer shawl. But she did it, and healing happened. Magic, superstition? Not according to Jesus. He turns to her and says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." Clearly for Jesus, faith in the peculiar love of God that he brings, an unconditional and all-embracing love, is the dynamic that enables healing, wholeness, peace to happen. Ironically, his disciples, his church over the centuries lost hold of this, and only now it is returning rather through the back door, through the medical profession itself. Dr. J.W. Provancha, M.D., writes, "It is sometimes forgotten that medicine owes its greatest debt not to Hippocrates, but to Jesus. It was the humble Galilean who more than any other figure in history bequeathed to the healing arts their motivation, their essential meaning and spirit. Jesus brings to our methods and armamentarium the corrective of love, without which true healing is rarely possible. The spiritual father of medicine was not Hippocrates of the island of Kos, but Jesus of the town of Nazareth. Because his spirit calls out again and again the kind of hope upon which all healing rests." A scientist by the name of Edward Stein writes, after passing through a period of severe doubt and turmoil and disease, "Who is this mysterious spirit that heals us, that binds us together, that rebuilds broken families, that heals the disturbed mind, that evokes tenderness and forgiveness and hope in us? In a sense, I do not know, but I sense his presence and I feel his power, and I've learned to trust his love, and that's enough." A recent survey of 269 physicians, 99% say they are convinced that faith in God is critical in enabling a healthy life. That's 20% higher than the population in general. Dr. Esther M. Sternberg, M.D., get this, is director of the Molecular, Cellular, and Behavioral Integrative Neuroscience Program and chief of the section on neuroendocrine immunology and behavior at the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Institutes of Health. How's that for credentials? She has a new study out, a very serious study called The Balance Within, which deals with the interaction between mind and body in both directions. She says there are two sides to prayer. One is what happens to the believer praying, and the other is the prayer itself. She says science cannot presume to have an explanation, nor to refute or to support the intrinsic power of prayer. But we can now address the first part of the equation, the things that change in the person praying. If prayers do heal, and there is no doubt that they do, at least a part of their effect must be the belief that they will heal. And the prayer which stimulates and sustains hope need not even be voiced. It's a movement, if you will. It may be as simple and as the desperate gesture of Our Lady without a name. Here's a lady who has a name. It's Barbara. She's 31 and the mother of 3 children. And she was staring at the possibility of thyroid cancer. As she awaited the results of the test, she revisited what she knew of her faith, and she found that she had more than a little. She found a metaphor for her personal situation in our story. One Sunday, she says, this gospel story of the woman with a hemorrhage kept rattling around in her head. The woman wanted to be healed, but she didn't want to bother Jesus, so she approached him in a crowd and just touched his robe. As Barbara prepared to go to communion, she suddenly thought, I could be like her. An Episcopalian, Barbara had always viewed the priest presiding at the Eucharist as a kind of stand-in for Jesus. So she decided she would simply reach out and touch his robe as he passed by. After receiving communion, she stood up. She says, I was so overwhelmed with God's presence that I knew I was healed. My healing wasn't physical, though, at that point. It was my heart that was healed. I wasn't anxious or afraid or doubtful or sad any longer. I had a trust in God, something He knew I needed far more than any other kind of healing in that hour. Today, Barbara is still leading a full life after a long siege of medical treatments, which hopefully will work out. But the real healing, she now recognizes, the real deliverance came when she rested her life in the God who is always near and was able, therefore, to let go of her understandable worry and fear. But now notice, though her prayer gesture of trust and hope did work toward greater physical health over time, she found the greater healing was, in fact, the quieting of anxiety and fear and doubt and despair. Because you see, these are the enemies of wholeness in our life as much or more than germs and cells. Disease is any impairment of our capacity to function with courage, with equanimity, with joy, any fragmentation of our spirit, even as any impairment of body. Jesus' words can be translated, your faith has made you whole. And that's what real health is finally all about. Wholeness of spirit, of emotion, focus of mind and purpose, so that we can effectively love God and neighbor and serve His world as we ought, as long as He gives us breath. And it is, above all, the faith which is hope that does it. Not dogma, but hope. Isn't it strange where you find hope? Sometimes I find it right in the midst of thoroughly discouraging circumstances where there seems little to look forward to. There, the presence of life-giving hope. Our Lady without a name had lived with a severe disability as a lonely outcast for 12 long years, and yet somehow she had not given up hope. She would try one more teacher, one more time. So hope seems a quality of person quite independent of externals, a spirit which has little to do with beauty or ability or strength or good fortune. And all the clinical studies are quite clear. Hope can make the critical tipping difference between health and disease. Andrew Greeley has put it, the hopeful person is the one who survives because he believes in survival. He lives because he believes in life, period. The hopeful person only dies once. He lives strongly and vitally right up to the point of death. Which is why hope is so important. Reversal, defeat, loss are an inevitable part of life, and it's the capacity, after digesting the blows and grieving the losses, the capacity to turn and look forward again, to believe in tomorrow, to reach out and touch, that saves us, keeps us going. Of course, this all leads to the question, what if physical health does not always return? What if it does run out on us? Well, first of all, it does not mean some lack of faith, some failure of hope. With the help of God, we struggle to hang on to the good gift of life so that we may serve Him and one another and our world. But it is a battle that even with God, we do not always win. My father did not many years ago at the age of 48, after fighting the good fight for 3 years. We said goodbye to a 42-year-old friend this week whose faith and courage were remarkable. I have never seen the like. Not for a minute would Jesus have us believe that this is in any sense a personal failure. Secondly, we need to keep in mind that though we sooner or later all lose the battle here, we do not lose the war. To die and to go to God is not the worst thing that can happen to us in life. I love the story Reynolds Green tells of a time when the great E. Stanley Jones, a famous missionary to India, was preaching for him in his church. Jones was then 88 years old and obviously frail and failing, but as he stood before the congregation, he said, "The next 10 years are going to be the greatest I've ever had." And the congregation stared incredulously at the feeble old man standing before them. And he continued with a twinkle in his eye, "I didn't say where they were going to be, but here or there they will be the greatest." You see, we need to remember that the ultimate healing is that of spirit and soul that enables us to face whatever comes with courage and some inner peace and joy. One of you sent me a copy of the commencement address given one year at Williams College by Richard Sewell, professor of English at Yale University. One of the strangest, perhaps most different commencement addresses I've ever read. In his address, he tells of his wife's struggle with cancer, and he closes with a letter that she wrote, her last letter as it was, to a friend, Holly Tuttle of New Haven, who had lost her husband some years before. "Dear Holly, you sent me such a good letter, I do want to answer. The problem of dealing with this fellow, death, has been interesting. Funny, what would women's libs say to my making death masculine? Surely I can't think of myself as being swept up by a lady. In the first place, when I saw him come striding up to my house, garbed in all his strange garments that we humans have wished on him, I wasn't in the least spooked. I opened the door and we had a nice chat. And subsequent chats have been reassuring, and I know now he's my good friend. I'm sure you've had a nodding acquaintance with him, so you've had the same feelings. And then there's love, the love of God, the love of friends and family. I feel I'd never have known its endless horizons if I'd lived out my full span. Somehow in a smooth life we take God and one another for granted, and even now, even with someone like Richard, new little vistas open up, and with casual acquaintances, whole worlds. My plumber, Tommy Cinderella, stopped in to see me after he'd attended to our various drips and leaks. He sat down and looked out at the view I have from my bed, a valley, a mill house, a waterfall, a lake, all hung in the most gorgeous autumn colors. "Mrs.," he said, "you gotta have faith. You have to pray. God's never failed me." "Tommy," I said, "some days I don't know where to aim my prayers. God is such a mystery." "Mrs.," he said, "don't you worry. I'll take over all the praying." And he took my two hands and leaned down and kissed me on the brow. So now, what do I have to worry about? Love till. Now there's one healthy lady. "Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace.